Pierre Rochard is a VP of research at Riot Platforms, which is one of the world's largest Bitcoin mining firms. Prior to Riot, he was a product manager at Kraken Digital Asset Exchange, where he led the product direction for Bitcoin and launched their Lightning product. He currently also co-hosts the Noted Bitcoin podcast and the Bitcoin for Advisors podcast. Pierre holds both a master's degree in accounting and a bachelor's in business administration from the University of Texas at Austin, and he has been thinking about and writing about Bitcoin since 2013 and co-founded the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute in 2014 to curate best-in-class primary source literature about Bitcoin. Pierre is an absolute legend in the Bitcoin space, both as a thought leader and a policy advocate, and I'm so thrilled to have him on the show today. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, welcome to another episode of the Block Reward podcast. Thrilled this week to have a very special guest, Pierre Rochard. Welcome to the show, Pierre.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
So we're going to be talking today about the economics of Bitcoin mining, energy efficiency, and some of the myths that surround that subject in general. Before we dive too into it, I'd love to ask you a little bit about some of your long history as an early Bitcoiner. You are sort of someone who you've been in the space for a very long time, and I've seen you say that you thought you were late when you arrived in like 2013.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I still feel late in the sense that I think that there's lots of opportunities to work on Bitcoin and to make improvements or to further understand Bitcoin. So I'm still learning new things about Bitcoin every day. And yeah, when I was entering in 2013, I was reading what others had written in like 2011, and I was like, oh, wow, those guys were learning about it early. And then the other part of it too is that as a broke college student, I wasn't like Michael Saylor with a company to leverage up or, what the Winklevi twins did with their settlement from Mark Zuckerberg. But in any case, I knew that I wanted to learn as much as I could about it because from a principled Austrian libertarian perspective, it seemed like this was the soundest money ever. So I was really interested in it from an ideological perspective of how do we get rid of fiat currency?
There was so many more unknowns at that time, and you've been through a number of cycles now. I've seen you say that you early on thought hyperbitcoinization would unfold quicker than it has.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how hyperbitcoinization is going?
Yeah. So I think one perspective is to look at it optimistically, glass half full, which is that here you have an asset that went from having no purchasing power in 2009 and one user, right, Satoshi, to now, depending how you define user, I define it very broadly of anybody who basically has economic exposure to Bitcoin, which includes people who own, shares of companies that have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And frankly, I'd say it includes every citizen of El Salvador. Right? They've got Bitcoin. And it turns out the U.S. government also has a large amount of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So maybe all U.S. citizens also are Bitcoin users by proxy of their government having not auctioned off those Bitcoin yet, but looks like they're planning to do it. Probably the worst trade in human history. But in any case, cheaper sats for the rest of us. So, now the purchasing power, of the whole system, let's look at like the market cap, basically. It's over $1 trillion. So in many regards, hyperbitcoinization has already happened, is already happening, is unfolding right before our eyes. And then I think the pessimistic half empty perspective is that why is it taking so long? This is superior monetary technology. Anybody exposed to it should immediately understand the advantages and want to buy some. Right? If they are thinking about it logically, right? So that is, I think, a really interesting area to delve into because, we have to study it from a microeconomic perspective, right? Because we always think about macro, right? And as Bitcoiners, we're always looking at the interest rate for the Fed or the halving, right? These are macro. If we look at it from a micro perspective, what ends up happening is these hodl waves, right? That Unchained Capital has identified in their research, which looking at the public ledger, you can see that during the bear market, you have people accumulating Bitcoin, putting it into long-term savings. And then during the bull market, you have people pulling Bitcoin out of their long-term savings and then converting it either because they are rebalancing their balance sheet, right? Because they hold too much Bitcoin, which I know as Bitcoiners, we don't like to hear that. But the reality is that if somebody can't sleep at night because they hold too much Bitcoin, it's to their detriment, right? They should sell some Bitcoin and, either pay off their mortgage if that helps them sleep at night, or perhaps what they need to do is just go buy some 60-40 stock and bond portfolio. It's not the case that they're selling all of their Bitcoin. It's just that they're looking at it of, okay, I'm going to sell 10% of my Bitcoin. So I lock that in, and there's that. And then, of course, there's people who want to put their nieces and nephews through college or whatever other life expenses they have where, if Bitcoin runs up, then you're definitely going to have turnover in who is holding the Bitcoin. And it's a bit more like a relay race, right? People say Bitcoin's a Ponzi scheme. And where that falls flat is that a lot of the early people who, I was just talking about the 2011 accumulators, imagine if you're buying Bitcoin at $1 and it goes up to $1,000, naturally you would expect people to sell. And that's what we see in the blockchain data. And it's also what I saw, when I was working at Kraken. You have lots of people who are very active in the market. It's funny too, because people criticize Bitcoin in the half-empty sense of not being a medium of exchange, right? Nobody's using it, or too few from their perspective are using it to buy goods and services. And this is where I think from a currency economics, monetary economics perspective, we can look at some of the work that's been done by Paul Krugman. He coined the term. He's actually coined two terms that are very relevant to Bitcoin. One is speculative attack, and the other is vehicle currency. So we can think of fiat currencies as vehicle currencies, where essentially if you're holding Bitcoin for, let's say you hold Bitcoin for 5 years, and then you go to an exchange and you convert it to dollars, and then you use those dollars to go buy a Lamborghini. The absolutists would say, hey, look, you did not convert your Bitcoin directly for the Lamborghini. Therefore, Bitcoin's not a real currency. And it's basically saying that, hey, if you are an American going to Europe and you spend your dollars on buying coffee and it automatically gets converted into euros by your debit or credit card when you swipe it, then somehow you're not really using dollars as a currency. When really it's just that there was a currency conversion because the local currency is different than my currency. And once we start looking at it from a subjective perspective, that's when we're entering into microeconomics, right? Of real Austrian economics is what I would say. And so that's where it becomes evident that people can adopt Bitcoin as their own currency. And then whenever they're interacting with the outside world, they're going to convert into the local currency by the most convenient means possible, right? Or the lowest cost means possible. And so when we look at the amount of trade volume, that is not just people buying and selling Bitcoin on exchanges now, but also people buying and selling the Bitcoin ETF, I do actually consider that to be medium of exchange use of Bitcoin. And so the other part of it too, the unit of account, you can price everything in Bitcoin, right? You can just, if you go to the supermarket, maybe with the augmented reality, Apple Pro headset, you could just have all the price tags be overlaid with an instant conversion into sats. And that's actually, maybe I should patent that because that sounds awesome. And so there's not really any, I think, like serious thought about, even from an Austrian perspective, they'll say, well, money is whatever everyone else is using, which to me really cuts against the grain of, hey, aren't we supposed to be subjectivists here? Like, decide what money is for yourself. You want Bitcoin to be your money. That's totally fine. Lots of liquidity, right? You can easily convert it. So that I think ties together the positive and the negative, which is that we always, myself included, have unrealistic expectations of, hey, Lightning is going to entirely replace the Visa network next week. But the reality ends up just being far more complicated, where I think we end up with both we're going to have Lightning and it's going to continue to grow, and we're going to have Visa. And actually, I think Visa is going to continue to grow. So kind of just an all of the above thinking. Now, the real controversy is about, is it going to replace the dollar or not, right? I think that's a controversy, both from economics perspective, but also from a political perspective. But happy to go in that direction, but I'll stop rambling here.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it immensely. What is your take on potential coexistence, long-term coexistence of the dollar and Bitcoin?
So if everybody is using Bitcoin as their money and they're only using the dollar as a vehicle currency and they never really want to hold dollars, they only want to convert into it as kind of a payments utility token, then the velocity of dollars would be infinite and the value of the dollar would go to zero because nobody wants to actually hold it. Everybody's trying to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And so if Bitcoin succeeds, then I do think that inevitably that means that the dollar has to be replaced. Now, the analogy I think would be Netflix versus Blockbuster. It's not a perfect analogy. It's got its limits, but basically the idea being that at some point, Blockbuster loses so many customers that they close the store, and any remaining customers now have to use Netflix. Like the store doesn't exist anymore, right? And so there is a tipping point where people will say, look, you're not going to get 100% adoption of Bitcoin. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But I think if we even get 20% adoption of Bitcoin, it's over for the dollar. at that point, you're so far reducing demand to hold dollars, especially if you've got people who are buying the Bitcoin ETF instead of buying like dollar denominated bonds, right? Or money market funds or all this stuff where the value of those relies on confidence, right? It relies on the trust and faith that people have. If you see the demand be diminished by even just at the margin, then I think that it spells doom for the dollar and that eventually you get to a tipping point. And that's what we refer to as hyperbitcoinization, is that tipping point of, if you think about like a black hole, right? The point of no return. But it's still speculative in the sense that it hasn't happened yet. So it's purely theoretical, but we can see parallels to it throughout history, the history of monetary economics, of one dominant global reserve currency being replaced by another different dominant global reserve currency, just like we went from the British pound to the US dollar through World War II. Now, I think that we're going to see it transition from the dollar to Bitcoin.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about, there's this argument that because it hasn't happened, that it won't happen, or even that it's not already happening right now. And it's like, how fast does this event have to unfold to qualify in people's minds as happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the frog getting boiled in a sense. And so perhaps some folks are in a state of denial, or that they just had such unrealistic expectations that they can't accept the reality is just a little bit slower.
Another Austrian idea, since you mentioned the Austrians, is sort of the how money regression theorem talks about how money naturally emerges. And the idea of, this baton idea that money would need to sort of diffuse. And so you mentioned the original holders that were buying Bitcoin early and they've sold, and some of their holdings would have been passed on. The ETFs now are accumulating at a unprecedented rate. And what do you think that means for the ongoing diffusion of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so there's actually a concept in neoclassical economics, which I think is really directly applicable as the Coase theorem. And basically, his theorem was that it doesn't really matter how you initially allocate property rights, as long as you do allocate them and you do it, you're consistent about it. And then the property will just naturally get redistributed to its most productive, economic use, basically. And I think that's what's playing out with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin going into the ETFs are essentially reallocating Bitcoin from, I don't know who, right? Like, I have a hard time relating to these people that presumably they were holding Bitcoin. Maybe they were holding Bitcoin at Coinbase. We'd have to look at the exchange flows, right? Because maybe what we're seeing is people selling custodial Bitcoin at Coinbase to an ETF that is buying it at Coinbase and then is just holding it at Coinbase, right? So from a blockchain perspective, like, we might not even see it from the HODL waves perspective because it's all internal to the Coinbase ledger, right? It never actually hits the chain. So maybe that's what's going on. But in any case, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people who just don't want to actually use the Bitcoin network, right? They're not looking for, or they're not aware of the properties that Bitcoin has that could benefit them for long-term savings. And instead, they're only looking at a price chart. And that's kind of to be expected in the sense that that's the natural entry point. Is you are watching CNBC and some random Bitcoiner comes on and is, talking about how great Bitcoin is while you're looking at a price chart where it's going straight up. And you're like, oh, okay, I should just FOMO in. And the most convenient way to do that used to be that you would go on Coinbase. Now, the most convenient way to do that is to just go straight into your brokerage account and buy the ETF. So I think that from a product management perspective, I worked at Crack, and there's a lot of friction involved in onboarding onto a new platform. Even if we try to make it as simple as possible, you're still talking about at least 10 clicks. Whereas buying an ETF, you're down to 3 clicks. And from a product perspective, that's just going to get more adoption, right? And the other part of it too is that once, I don't want to insult anyone, but there's kind of a unit bias. So it might be easier to buy Bitcoin if you're buying $30 share of the IBIT ETF than buying a fraction of a Bitcoin at $70,000. So maybe it's an IQ test on some level, but I also think that we have to be diplomatic in the sense that Bitcoin's going to attract a lot of different use cases, a lot of different users. And so even though we like cold storage, we like, holding your own keys and all of that, realistically, as Bitcoin scales, perhaps what we're going to see is that fewer and fewer as a percentage of the total population of Bitcoiners are actually interested in the underlying technology, just as when we saw the development of cars, fewer and fewer people who own cars actually cared about how the car works. Right. It used to be the case that in order for you to own a car, you had to be kind of handy, right? You had to know how to wrench on the engine. Now it's kind of unusual if you have a problem with your car engine, right? You take it to the shop and you let the professionals handle it for the most part. I know that there's still some gearheads out there. So I think that's just naturally with any technology, you kind of move from, and same thing with microcomputers. It used to be the case that people were just making computers in their garage and buying the components. They'd buy like computer kits. Now that still exists, right? You still have like hardcore gamers, myself included. Like we like to build our own PCs and, we do it from scratch. Well, not from scratch, right? We still buy the components. But the point being that I think that this is the natural evolution of technology. What could happen negatively, and that we've seen happen in the past, is the government decides to seize those Bitcoin that are kind of centralized. And that would be bad in the sense that anybody who owns those ETFs would lose value. But it would be good as a cautionary tale of, hey, here's why holding your own keys actually is good. And you were kind of misusing Bitcoin by wrapping it in an ETF. And then we have to look at the probabilities, right? What are the chances of the government actually doing that? I think that they're relatively low, but we have to be vigilant. Like Benjamin Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. If we just take it for granted that the government is the government, or, that we're not involved in the policymaking process, then I think that increases the probability of the government trying to seize Bitcoin from ETFs. So we have to just stay engaged in the policy process and also stay engaged in the electoral process. We have some great pro-Bitcoin candidates that are running in this election. And essentially what we have to do is we have to punish the enemies of Bitcoin by making sure they don't get reelected, even if that means that they get replaced by someone who's agnostic about Bitcoin, right? As long as we're getting rid of the anti-Bitcoin politicians or mounting credible threats, right? So even if we lose the election, perhaps if we get close enough, they back off this issue, right? And they find another issue to try to promote a career. What we want to make it is like, attacking Bitcoin is basically in U.S. politics, they call it like the third rail of politics is what you get electrocuted on. So if you, for example, in the U.S., if you touch Social Security, because, it is a Ponzi scheme, but lots of people are depending on their check, then you lose the election. So we want to have that same approach of, yeah, you can criticize Bitcoin, but you're going to lose the next election. And then if you do it through executive action, then we're going to take you to court and you're going to lose in court. And so that's where, we have to be very active in assuming that our goal here is to have more liberty. If the goal is to live in a dystopia where, Bitcoin only exists on a black market, then we should be donating to Elizabeth Warren, right? We should be encouraging a crackdown on Bitcoin. I reject that as a goal. It might be a future outcome, but that would be a negative outcome. I think we should try to go in the opposite direction.
Do you think that the participation of Wall Street in Bitcoin makes it more or less politically attack resistant?
I think that equal portions of both. So I think that the way it makes it more attack resistant is that the financial sector does spend a lot of money on lobbying the government. And so even what we're seeing emerge is that the banks are coming out, the commercial banks. So Wall Street is not unified, right? Wall Street has its different silos within it. And so you have what I would call the capital markets side of Bitcoin, of Wall Street, which is it's BlackRock, it's the exchanges. They love Bitcoin, right? And these ETFs are working really well for them. And so then you've got the investment banks. The investment banks obviously have a limited role with regards to the ETFs, but in terms of all of the securities, for example, MicroStrategy, the Bitcoin miners, all of these publicly traded companies that have Bitcoin exposure, Coinbase, those are beneficial to the investment bankers. So they get deal flow from that. And then you have the commercial banks, and the commercial banks are under the purview of the Federal Reserve and the FDIC. And so they are heavily regulated, far more than the investment banks and the asset managers and the capital markets. So what they are seeing is essentially a regulatory arbitrage, right? Of, okay, well, I cannot buy Bitcoin at JP Morgan Chase. I cannot buy Bitcoin at Wells Fargo, Therefore, I'm going to transfer my money from my checking account to my brokerage account at Fidelity, and then I'm going to buy the Bitcoin ETF at Fidelity. And so the commercial banks are like, okay, how do we stop these outflows? Well, we can stop them by offering Bitcoin. And that's what they're trying to change with, it's a SEC SOB 121 regulation about who, what you can custody and how much capital you have to custody it and all that. And so it is creating like competition within Wall Street. Okay, how do we launch Bitcoin products so that we, are able to grow in this area that is seeing just tremendous excitement from our customers? They can only ignore clients for so long, right? They are, at the end of the day, for-profit businesses. If anything, they've been criticized for being too greedy. So they look at it rationally, right? And the more that they have their clients telling them about Bitcoin, the more they themselves start buying into, I say that, but it's really, they start to understand Bitcoin. And we've seen the head of BlackRock, he's been on, Bloomberg and CNBC talking about how Bitcoin is like digital gold because he's trying to sell his ETF, right? He's trying to get more ETF adoption. And that turns him into a salesperson for Bitcoin, which I think is fantastic. Now, the negative is that there are a lot of politicians in DC that don't like Wall Street and they don't like Bitcoin. And so to them, seeing Wall Street and Bitcoin join forces, I think it scares them, but it should scare them. And so we'll see them get increasingly hostile. And we just saw them send a letter. Now, the maximalist side of me like this letter, but realistically, it's a bad letter where they're telling the SEC, hey, don't approve any further ETFs, right, for Ethereum and others. But the bad part of the letter is that they're also saying that be very cautious about how people are promoting these ETFs. And so, for example, they say that it's not okay to equate Bitcoin with cash. And so they don't even like the terminology cryptocurrency because they'll say, oh, hey, it's not a currency, which goes back to our first point about what's a currency, what's money, what's Bitcoin. And so I think there's going to be some push and pull and some fireworks in terms of the conflict between Wall Street and the executive branch agencies and the legislature. Now, the great news is that the courts are on the side of, I'd say the courts are really standing out as putting tremendous limitations on the power of the executive branch at this time. And this is not just limited to our industry. Throughout kind of a lot of other industries that have been seeing a lot of regulatory action, the courts have been increasingly not suspicious of, but skeptical of some of the statements made by the government. Because basically, the executive branch, those agencies should exist as just what was created by the legislature. And if it was created in 1970 and times have changed, there's this question of, okay, well, do we have to go back and change the law? Or can the executive agency just kind of evolve on its own? And over the past several decades, the approach has been that the agency can just evolve on its own. Now, though, things have dramatically changed. And because the agencies have evolved so far from the statutes that were passed many decades ago, now there's questions of, okay, do we need to make it so that the law sunsets and expires? And then you need to pass another framework so that we don't have this kind of creeping jurisdiction? Or do we just need the courts to step in and say, no, like if it's not in what was passed 50 years ago, then you can't do it. And so the courts are increasingly adopting that view. It's to the benefit of Bitcoin tremendously because Bitcoin did not exist 50 years ago. So any kind of executive action against Bitcoin immediately raises the question of, well, look, whoever wrote this law had no idea about Bitcoin, so it can't apply. And I think that's a great evolution.
Hey, everybody. I'm thrilled to announce that Block Rewards has come on board as a sponsor for the 2024 Canadian Bitcoin Conference happening in Montreal, May 16th to the 18th. It's going to be a great event with an unreal lineup of speakers, and we couldn't be more excited about being involved. If you're thinking about going and you don't have your tickets yet, you get 10% off of your pass using the code BLOCK2024, and that's all capital letters. And you can get those tickets at CanadianBitcoinConf.com. Hope to see you there. So Bitcoin mining is kind of at the nexus of this potential overregulation, call it. You see, it's the EIA, right? That is sort of starting to behave like a partisan arm of the Democrat Party in engaging in kind of a surveillance of Bitcoin mining operations, which is just kind of a weird thing. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and maybe this weird idea of how we're sort of getting the message that energy usage of any kind is bad, and it's the government's job to tell us the right ways to use energy.
Yeah, and this really stems out of us leaving the gold standard in 1971. So, the inflationary pressure on energy prices has, I think, created political pressure to regulate this area and to steer it. And especially under the Biden administration, they've adopted a policy of active industrial intervention, right? So they want to decide where they want to marshal the nation's resources towards the ends that they deem to be the best, right? And Bitcoin mining in many ways is something that is twofold. One, there's the energy use, which I think that if we look at it objectively, the energy use is fine because there's a lot of extra energy in the system. Let's talk about the electrical grid because there's other forms of energy, right? But I think the grid is what was the focus of this EIA survey and what they're most interested in. The grid is built for peak load. Now, peak load is maybe, let's call it 20% of the time, generously. Usually it's less than that. And the rest of the time, there's lots of extra capacity on the grid. And so if Bitcoin miners are able to provide revenue for all the participants during those off-peak hours, and then they turn off during times of peak load, there really is not any kind of macro issue from Bitcoin mining's energy use. It's actually a tremendous benefit because now those resources, those generators, have the revenues to grow and to expand and then to better serve peak load. It also reduces the cost for all the other participants because otherwise those capital investments, those have to be amortized over kind of the existing set of loads. If you add flexible load, then it can actually absorb a lot of the cost without creating the peak load demand, right? Because the Bitcoin miners are turned off during those times. So I think that narrative is well understood, including in the Department of Energy, I would argue, actually. They have very smart people and they understand this. The challenge for them is that there's tremendous political pressure from Senator Elizabeth Warren to crack down on Bitcoin mining. Now, the argument she uses is one relating to carbon emissions, that Bitcoin miners, while they might not be contributing to peak load, she has not conceded that yet, but let's assume that she would eventually concede that off-peak, they are incentivizing natural gas generators. And so that means that those natural gas generators are emitting more CO2 than they otherwise would have without Bitcoin miners. So there's a few problems with that narrative. One is that natural gas generators are the most economical way of generating electricity in the United States, and that they are already regulated by the EPA. And the EPA already has a rulemaking in progress with regards to greenhouse gases. And so it's kind of the existing approach to mitigating carbon emissions from grid generators is already load agnostic. So, the EPA regulating a natural gas generator really doesn't say anything about Bitcoin mining. And I'd argue it shouldn't because it's orthogonal, right? It's just talking about two different industries. We're talking about a load versus a generator. But Elizabeth Warren is intent on conflating the two. It's really important for her that the two get conflated because it's actually pretextual. Pretext it's an interesting legal concept I've learned about recently, which is that an agency might say they're doing something for one reason, but the real reason is going unstated. And if you can actually reveal the real reason and you can debunk the fake reason, then you've got grounds for a legal challenge. And here I think it's pretty much a slam dunk thanks to Elizabeth Warren, because she has provided all of the evidence we need to know that it's pretextual, because she has said that her real reason is she wants a CBDC and she doesn't want Bitcoin competing against a CBDC. And so whether it's Bitcoin mining or there's another side to this, which is the AML KYC side, right? So she talks about how terrorists are getting financing from Bitcoin when in reality, they're getting almost 100% of the financing from fiat, right? So it's kind of a nonsense, but she knows it's a nonsense because it's just a front, right? And her real reason is that she doesn't want competition against the CBDC, but that reason doesn't really hold up in the court of public opinion, and it certainly doesn't hold up in federal court, right? Where you just can't advance policies that way. If she wants a CBDC, she has to get Congress to pass legislation that enables a CBDC and that does actually try to go after Bitcoin, right? But there's no legislation that has been passed yet. She is trying to pass legislation that would ban Bitcoin. It's just she's having a hard time there. And that means that she needs to find alternatives, right? Flanking maneuvers in order to find other ways to harass the Bitcoin industry through the executive branch by weaponizing what should be nonpartisan, what should be, science-driven agencies like the EIA, like the Department of Energy, that thankfully failed because the EIA, they made some mistakes. I don't know if those mistakes were real mistakes or if they were intentional. They declared an emergency, which didn't hold up in court because there is no emergency. And then also their survey itself was just, it wasn't well thought through. And that would have been revealed if they had what's called a notice and comment period. So normally when you put out a survey, you have to get feedback from the public about the survey before you send the survey out. And they short-circuited that by declaring an emergency, which means that they tried to send out a survey that was flawed and there was no emergency. So we took them to court. Riot did, as well as the Texas Blockchain Council, which is kind of our trade association here in Texas. We went to the federal court in Waco, which is the one that's closest to our facility on Rockdale. And the federal judge, I was actually surprised by what happened in the courtroom. I was in there ready to take the witness stand, but it turned out to not be necessary because the judge basically told them right away, told the government that this was not moving forward, right? That they would have to either find a settlement with the Bitcoin miners and, accept defeat voluntarily, or that he would force them to surrender and, have a permanent injunction is what it's called from a legal perspective of, hey, you're not allowed to do this and don't even try. So they did settle. So they destroyed all the data that they had received and they are starting the process over. Now, I don't know if they have started the process over yet. I haven't heard that they have. I think I'll hear about it if they do, but it looks like they are rethinking things. And hopefully what they realize through this is that they can't just go along with whatever Elizabeth Warren is saying, right? She is just one senator from Massachusetts, and that this policy reaches far beyond her. In fact, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, he said that Bitcoin is bigger than any government. I was astonished to hear that coming from him because that's really an extremist, Bitcoin position, but it's one that I share with him. And I think that it's one that Elizabeth Warren and the EIA should realize is that they should actually approach this with a lot more humility and figure out how do we have a pro-Bitcoin policy in the United States? And I think that the EIA could actually play an important role in that. I'm not saying that we should not have any kind of data collection, although if we look at the original purpose of, hey, they put price controls on energy because of inflation, and then we had shortages because of price controls, and then we had data collection because of shortages. Well, if we fix the money and we don't have inflation anymore, and instead we have deflation and energy prices are going down, well, we don't need to worry about collecting data because the market is functioning, right? And people are getting less and less expensive electricity, and they're not complaining to their politicians. So maybe we just solve the root problem, Bitcoin. But short of that, I think that it is reasonable for large grid participants, and the EIA does already collect information about electricity consumption, right? They have 3 categories of electricity consumption: residential, commercial, and industrial. And they've had those 3 categories for decades now. And then Elizabeth Warren comes along and says, hey, I'd like for you to add a sub category of Bitcoin mining and, fit it into your multi-decade long survey process. And I can understand that they would be reluctant to look at this any differently than any industrial load, right? They're like, well, we already track industrial loads. Bitcoin miners are already part of that. We don't need to add lots of duplicative data that doesn't really add anything to the conversation, because at the end of the day, they're looking at it from a macro perspective of okay, well, the industrial use of electricity is increasing. How do we match that up with more solar and wind, right? And Bitcoin mining does fit very well with renewables in the sense that renewables are intermittent. In Texas, in particular, we have a lot of wind and solar, and it's not always sunny and it's not always windy. So during times when, we don't have enough wind and sun, it's nice to have a load that is flexible and can turn off like Bitcoin miners. Anyway, that's where we could make an argument that, okay, maybe the EIA should collect data about these large flexible loads, but it raises the question of who do they collect the data from? They already collect data from grid operators like ERCOT. So ERCOT already has the data. It would make sense for them to just share it with the EIA. And you don't need to send a letter to every Bitcoin miner on the grid. All you need to do is send a letter to each grid operator. And there's maybe maximum a dozen in the United States that you need to send a letter to. And they'll provide all that data. And then, they can make a chart or something, whatever they wanted to do. But to show that Bitcoin miners are responsive to demand, and so they don't contribute to peak load, and that, this is a non-issue. But I don't think that it'll fix the problem that Elizabeth Warren has, which is that Bitcoin mining is destroying what she sees as the most precious resource in the world. And that's not electricity. It's seigniorage. So seigniorage is the monopoly profits from issuing a currency. And Elizabeth Warren loves seigniorage because it allows her to spend dollars on her priorities without having to pay a cost. Instead, that cost is borne by everybody who holds dollars and gets diluted and has, less purchasing power because of inflation. And Bitcoin would, if Bitcoin did replace the dollar, then Bitcoin mining as kind of the way that you issue, the asset onto the ledger, it means that there's no monopoly profits, right? It's a hyper-competitive industry, and being profitable in Bitcoin mining is very challenging, and especially, with halvings and all that. So that means that she would not have those monopoly profits to spend on her political priorities. And that, I think, is the biggest risk for her. The other risk is that she can't micromanage how people are spending their money. So she wants the Fed to be able to bully people into spending their money to stimulate the economy, ahead of an election or whatever it is. And likewise, she also wants to be able to essentially, steer the flow of money towards her priorities. So, for example, perhaps she wouldn't let you spend your dollars to buy gasoline, right? You have to spend your dollars at a Tesla power charging station. And that's really where we get into like the social credit score type dystopia that we read about of China, and that's probably where Elizabeth Warren wants to go on this.
I think she has been successful, at least in creating maybe a general level of confusion around, how bad for the environment Bitcoin. It's complicated stuff, right? And for people who aren't in the weeds, how can normal people be expected to, understand it, let alone, without having done a deep dive themselves? If you had to summarize the misconception around Bitcoin mining, energy use, and the environment, so that someone who was a complete outsider could understand how it's useful and misrepresented, could you take a stab at it?
Yeah, absolutely. That the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining is close to zero, and that the environmental impact of power generation is a problem. In particular, that I would point to coal power plants that not only do they have greenhouse gases, they also have particulate matter. And I think this might actually be the greater pollutant or health risk is particulate matter from not just coal-fired power plants, really. I think that internal combustion engines of cars. And this is where it just makes a lot of sense that, hey, let's find ways to replace these technologies with things that are, better for our lungs. Greenhouse gases are not bad for our lungs. The problem is, at the climate change level. And at the climate change level, we have to think globally, right? And this is something that I think gets missed a lot in the environmentalist conversation, which is that there are problems that are local in nature. So if you're dumping, I don't know, arsenic into a river, right? That's a local problem that, needs to get cleaned up. And then there's global problems. The most recent global problem that was solved was the ozone layer, that emitting CFCs was causing a hole in the ozone layer, which was actually causing environmental problems. We stopped, and the Montreal Protocol looked at, okay, what are the specific sources of CFCs that are causing this hole? And let's ban those. Let's make those illegal, right? They didn't get into questions of, we have to regulate refrigeration and people have to use less refrigerators because refrigerators emit CFCs, right? It was more like, okay, let's just make refrigerators that don't emit CFCs. And that way we don't have to decide how many refrigerators you can have per household, right? And that approach was very successful. We fixed the ozone problem. So I think that is the correct approach to any kind of pollutant. And so if the determination is that greenhouse gases are a pollutant, then we have to go to the sources of greenhouse gases. And the sources are not electronics, right? They're not Bitcoin mining. The sources are coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants. And how do we prevent the greenhouse gases from those? Well, we can either, ban them outright. We can have carbon capture, which is another technology where you pump the CO2 back into the earth. People debate whether that's science fiction or not. You can also have scrubbers that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We see people do this or theorize about it using nuclear power. I'm agnostic as to what the technology ought to be there if the determination is that greenhouse gases are a pollutant. I just don't think it has anything to do with the Bitcoin mining industry. You can mine Bitcoin using any source of electricity. It doesn't have to be a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas plant. The other part of it, though, that we have to be mindful of from a policy perspective is the global nature of greenhouse gases. And where are greenhouse gases coming from today? China. So any kind of solution has to really be inclusive of China, of other places that are building new new sources of greenhouse gases, whether it's natural gas plants or coal plants. In Texas, what is being built is more solar. And so if we look at it, okay, are Bitcoin miners adding more solar generation or more natural gas generation? It's definitely the case that they're adding more solar generation because there is no new natural gas generation being commissioned currently. I think that there are plans for more natural gas generation in Texas because that's what everyone has voted for. And that's, I think, the other reality that folks who are looking at greenhouse gas emissions have to contend with, which is the voters. Ultimately, we live in a democracy. And so if people are voting for cheaper power and they're not voting for lower carbon emissions, the only way to change that is by educating the public. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who has not heard about climate change. So I think the voting public is actually fully educated on this issue, and that what they're seeing is that the greater risk is to not have electricity. That's the greater risk than to have, flooding or a hurricane or, extreme weather event. And if we look at the actuarial data of, okay, what happens if you don't have electricity versus what happens if you have extreme weather? The odds of you dying are much higher without electricity. But the odds of you dying from extreme weather, they've never been lower in human history. They actually keeps going lower, right? And a lot of that is actually due to our ability to consume electricity and to build safer structures, right? So building a skyscraper that can withstand a hurricane is going to consume more electricity, right, from steel and cement than to build a straw hut that would get destroyed by a hurricane. And so in many ways, our ability to survive and to be resilient as a civilization does depend on cheap electricity. Perhaps there's a role for government to steer things with industrial policy. I personally, I'm skeptical of that, but we also do have some, let's call them historical precedents, especially from where I lived previously in France, right? They had an industrial policy of, hey, let's build a lot of nuclear reactors. And they built a lot of nuclear reactors and it produces a lot of electricity, but then the political winds changed. Now, some say that the political winds changed because, the communist Soviet Union caused Chernobyl and that was bad. I think you can build safe nuclear reactors. I don't think that the commies did that. I think they made a dangerous nuclear reactor, but I see that as a criticism of communism, not of nuclear reactors. I think that we could build safe nuclear reactors, and we have, right? The list of things that have gone wrong with nuclear reactors is very short. The other part of it too, though, I think is that there's a lot of lobbying that happens indirectly from perhaps Russia that wants to sell natural gas to the West that would infiltrate environmentalist movements and radicalize them against nuclear energy. And that is a twofold advantage for Russia. One is that they can sell more natural gas. And two is that it actually reduces kind of the nuclear budget for the West, right? And Russia is still very much in the mindset of nuclear weapons are on the table, and they're still in the Cold War, right? And we've seen them threaten the use of nuclear weapons relatively recently. I think that the environmentalists have to start having a more adversarial mindset of, hey, our movement is prone to getting hijacked by foreign powers, so we still have to make it science-based, and the science is definitely in favor of nuclear. And so if we're going to have an active industrial policy, it cannot just be for wind, solar, and battery. You have to add nuclear into the mix. And I think that that's currently evolving in the West.
Yeah, and there is this weird disconnect that has been successful in the West as well of convincing people that reducing electricity use is good when, electricity consumption is closely tied with sort of societal flourishing for sure.
Well, that came out of, I think that actually came out of the collapse of communism, that essentially what you had was a conversion of from communism into environmentalism on the left, because basically communism had failed to increase people's standards of living where capitalism had succeeded. And so then it was like, oh, actually, the goal was never to increase standards of living at all. In fact, increasing standards of living is bad. What we want is degrowth. And what we want is conservation of energy rather than expenditure of energy. And so they kind of, as a coping mechanism, adopted environmentalism. And one of my favorite economists, George Reisman, he called it the watermelon. Green on the outside, red on the inside, right? Is that they wrapped Marxism into a degrowth ideology so that they can still continue to be communists, right? That they're saying that, well, now we're going to have central planning through the mechanism of carbon emissions. And that's how we're going to control all economic activity. And so then they can still have power, right? That's really their goal on a personal level is power, right? That's what they're interested in. In Latin, we call it the libido dominandi, the desire to rule over others. It is a bit of it's kind of a mental illness, I'd argue, but it's also just something that we have to be aware of, and that Bitcoin is so toxic too, right? Bitcoin's the opposite of that, of self-sovereignty, of you don't get to rule over others, and I think that drives a lot of the animus towards it.
We're headed into a halving right away, and Bitcoin mining is closely connected to halvings and energy consumption. In 2017, I think it was the World Economic Forum predicted that by 2020, Bitcoin mining would be consuming, all of the world's energy, and energy use in mining probably hasn't grown at the rate people might have thought. Maybe just can you comment a little bit on the growth of the energy consumption in mining and that trend?
Yes. So I think that there's a lot of moving parts. So I forgive them for getting it wrong, but they seem to always get it wrong in one direction, right? Which is that they are trying to be critical of Bitcoin mining and trying to demonize it and make it seem like it's something that's out of control and that's, growing like a cancer, on society. When the reality is very different. So the halving does definitely throttle the growth of the industry, as does the volatility of the Bitcoin price, right? So we have to think about it from a risk premium perspective. The Bitcoin mining is a derivative on the Bitcoin price. And so the more volatility there is on the Bitcoin price, the more Bitcoin mining gets discounted because the riskier it is to enter the industry. And so the less you have of it. And so I think the Bitcoin mining, in a way, it's not just volatile from electricity price or a Bitcoin price or a transaction fee perspective. It's also volatile from a capital markets perspective, right? Sometimes there's lots of capital to invest in Bitcoin mining, and oftentimes those are the not great times to be entering, right? So that's when hash price is expensive. It's when there's euphoria. And then during the bear market, when you're supposed to be building, then you're very capital constrained because there's just, capital is a lot more expensive. And so I think that's where, the growth of Bitcoin mining does not track the Bitcoin price one for one. It is far more indirect and long term. Everybody is trying to price in the halving. And then there's also the question of, do you buy Bitcoin or do you get into Bitcoin mining, right? And so by having the ability to just buy Bitcoin and, sit on your hands, that also removes a lot of competition from Bitcoin mining, and removes kind of the number of entrants. That also contributes to the profitability of the incumbents, right? And so, in a way, whoever is willing to warehouse that risk is going to get paid for it. They just have to remain solvent. So that's where you got to have a strong balance sheet and a long-term vision for it.
I could talk about this stuff with you all day, Pierre. In the interest of maybe keeping the conversation at a reasonable length, we didn't get around to the question that I like to start every episode with, which is, what is Bitcoin? And everyone has a different answer. I'd love to just hear your take.
It's software at the end of the day, right? It's an open source protocol. And something I've been thinking about too is that, yes, it's software, but it also has to exist in hardware. And the node functionality is easy for it to exist in hardware, right? Because it just requires general purpose computing. The mining part, the hashing, has gotten so specialized in the hardware. This is where I was thinking about proof of stake. This guy asked me, he was like, hey, look, proof of stake is secure enough, right? He was referring to the CEO of AMD, who had said, oh, Bitcoin mining, let's look at new technologies like proof of stake because they're secure enough. And I was thinking about the fact that in some ways that's correct, that you can have a proof of stake protocol that is secure enough. There's two limitations. One is, how do you issue the asset? Because proof of stake presupposes that the asset has been issued, right? Otherwise, you can't stake it. And so you have to have some initial distribution mechanism. Now, you can have, like Ethereum did, where, okay, you've got a pre-sale, the ICO, and then you have mining, and then you have proof of stake. And so then you already have ETH on the ledger and you can stake it. The other part of it that I was thinking about it, though, which I think is underexplored, is the nature of physical reality and hardware from a security perspective versus software and private keys. So staking is vulnerable to, hey, what if the hotkeys, right, or even if they're cold, right, and you have some kind of separation, what if those keys get compromised and stolen? Versus, what if the Bitcoin mining rigs get stolen? Now, you have to steal them in physical reality, right? You have to steal the mining rigs. The keys, you can steal them in cyberspace. And so, in some ways, there's an interesting level of cost associated, right? Where I think it's actually higher cost to steal things in physical reality. And then, not only that, but you have to steal it and then maintain the physical security going forward, right? So, let's say you were to steal 100,000 mining rigs from our facility in Rockdale. You have to have the government on your side, because you can't steal those mining rigs without the government helping you, right? If the government is opposed to you because they're defending property rights, then you're screwed. There's no way you get away with it. It's harder it's almost like it'd be easier to steal physical cash, right? It's lighter than mining rigs. And per value, gold is lighter than mining rigs, right? So it's really a very inconvenient physical asset to steal. And then even if you steal it in cyberspace by hijacking the hash rate, all we have to do is turn off the machines, right? So we have a electrical system where we can manually flip the breaker, right? And turn off the facility. So even if you steal the hash rate, we can immediately steal it back. And that's not possible with private keys. With private keys, you would have to do a hard fork, right? Steal the Bitcoin or the Ethereum back. And that's where I was thinking about the security model of the consensus mechanism of proof of work versus proof of stake. We can't limit the analysis to how much would it cost for me to build this many mining rigs, right? Which I think historically has been kind of the analysis. You have to look at, okay, as a practical matter, let's assume that there's a 0-day cybersecurity vulnerability. What happens next? What's the cost of recovery? And I think the cost of recovery on the Bitcoin side is far lower than the cost of recovery on the proof of stake side. It's something I've been thinking about. I think that there needs to be more research in this area.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and you're going to have me up at night now pondering that. Pierre, this has been a real pleasure, man. I appreciate you coming on. I've learned a lot from you, and fan of all your efforts in the industry, both in terms of education and the work you do lobbying for public policy.
Of course. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And if you've listened all the way to the end of the show, I want to thank you for tuning in as well. Appreciate your attention. Attention is currency. And we're doing our best here to create Bitcoin content for everyone that's accessible and interesting. And thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.